My name is Terry Bowler, and I will be your host. This webinar will take approximately 60 minutes, with the last 30 minutes being a time of question and answers. This webinar is designed to be interactive to better understand the content, so we encourage you to ask questions by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. You will be able to preview and enter questions, and these comments or questions will be answered during the Q&A session. All of our participants are in a listen-only mode. This webinar is hosted by Emanate Life Sciences. Emanate's mission is to help their clients bring products to market that improve people's lives. As a data management functional service provider, Emanate provides both full service and contract consultants. Emanate understands the technical challenges of imaging and CEC adjudication between sites, core labs, and sponsors. Emanate can assist your study team implement solutions with optimized processes that are both PHI and 21 CFR compliant. To request additional information, visit Emanate's website at www.emanatelifesciences.com. I'd like to also introduce our two sponsors for today. One of our sponsors is Criterion Edge. Criterion Edge is a regulatory writing company that provides outsourced writing services to the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. The company's expertise in regulatory writing best practices, honed over decades, produces superior deliverables and provides budget, resource, and timeline flexibility for regulatory managers. Criterion Edge empowers companies to deliver superior healthcare solutions. To learn more about how Criterion Edge can help you achieve your regulatory goals, see CriterionEdge.com or contact the company at info@CriterionEdge.com. Our other sponsor is AG Mednet. AG Mednet is a software-as-a-service clinical trial infrastructure provider. The company's mission is to enable sponsors, CROs, AROs, and other specialty service providers to improve workflow management, data quality, and efficiency in clinical trial processes. AG Mednet is the clear leader in medical image management with more than 1,300 trials on its platform. AG Mednet's JUDI adjudication platform is currently in use, supporting more than 60 clinical endpoint and adverse event adjudication projects involving more than 50,000 cases. To learn more about how AG Mednet can help you address challenging clinical trial workflows, see agmednet.com or contact the company at info@agmednet.com. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Kyoko Hattori. Kyoko brings a wealth of expertise to the area of clinical safety. With more than 20 years of a variety of clinical research experience, she's done it all, from bedside nursing and critical care to clinical research in both academic hospitals and outpatient clinic settings. On the industry side, she has worked at 2 major medical device manufacturers as a CRA, and also in clinical safety management, and most recently, at an international CRO as the Director of Pharmacovigilance. Kyoko has led international clinical safety teams that have contributed to the key safety data for product approvals in the US, EMEA, and Asia-Pacific geographies. Kyoko holds a Master of Science in Nursing degree in the Clinical Research Administration track at the George Washington University. She is currently the Vice President of Scientific and Medical Affairs at Criterion Edge. Our other presenter is Brian Kelly. Brian is the Vice President of Business Development and Sales for AG Mednet. Brian has more than 25 years of experience in technical services, project management, and sales, primarily in the field of clinical research. Brian's main job is helping his clients identify and solve problems. Prior to joining AG Mednet in 2010, Brian spent the previous 10 years within the imaging core lab industry. With AG Mednet, Brian has helped grow the company's flagship imaging business into the industry leader and has helped introduce several new products to the market on the JUDI platform. At this point, I'd like to pass this over to Kyoko if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Terry. My first slide is missing, but I'll just chat through it. To continue from my last webinar in September, I'll introduce the internal hands-on tasks that are involved in processing events for CC adjudication. I'll continue to use MI wherever examples are helpful. Those of you not familiar with the process may be wondering what could be so hard about processing an event for CEC review. As I presented in my last webinar, the FDA acknowledged in an editorial in the American Heart Journal that this is a very labor-intensive and time-consuming process, and encouraged focused approaches to the CEC process depending on study type or therapeutic area. For my portion of this session, I'll share my own experience from multiple adjudication models and delve into the specific tasks that are involved in the life of an event, beginning from the initial report of the AE or SAE, all the way up to the end product, which is your clinical study endpoint. Not advancing. There we go. Excuse me. The sponsor can screen for potential endpoint events or rely on site-reported events by creating endpoint-specific CRF, such as an MI-CRF. As I explained in the last webinar, however, the latter carries a risk that the investigator's clinical diagnosis in the real-world practice typically do not match the study-specific definitions of that event, and that endpoint events can be missed. Sponsor screening can be performed by keyword AE term searches that describe the potential event, which is best accomplished when the AEs are coded in a standard dictionary such as MedDRA. A search could also encompass a wider net for capturing other AEs that may indicate a potential endpoint, such as the report of a chest pain, which could meet a study definition in MI based on the secondary data. Apart from or in addition to the event term search, secondary screening can encompass the criteria of the endpoint event definitions, such as cardiac enzyme or biomarker values or EKG changes. This can be accomplished effectively by aggregate reviews when the CRFs are well designed to capture all the critical elements. The next step is to request the site to submit the required source documents that should be defined in the CEC MOP. Depending on what systems or the lack of that the sponsor has, this request could be made in the form of a query within the EDC or an email requested outside of the system, or both. The medical review of the received source document should be performed with the goal that only a single complete set of source documents would be submitted to the CEC, and for the adjudication to occur once and only once with no additional interim steps. The reviewer should confirm that the documents belong to the correct patient and/or the event to be adjudicated. Sponsors should be aware that a typical study coordinator is juggling multiple studies and requests. It is easy to make an administrative error of sending the documents on the wrong patient in the same study or the wrong hospitalization record on the correct patient, especially if there were multiple events for that patient. The reviewer should also confirm that all critical documents are received and make additional requests for missing documents. Safety queries should be issued to resolve discrepancies between critical data entered in the EDC and those documented in the medical records. A simple transposition of cardiac enzyme values or the upper reference limits can literally make or break a potential MI case. The reviewer may also need to trim down the received source documents to only what is required for the adjudication. It is not uncommon that a busy coordinator sends in all documents associated with the hospitalization that can easily total to more than 100 pages. If the packet is not trimmed down to only what is needed for the adjudication, it will slow down the CEC process by forcing the adjudicators to sift through for the pertinent information. Aside from medical review, all direct and indirect information pertaining to the treatment assignment should be meticulously redacted from all documents to prevent unblinding to the adjudicators. The submission packet will be compiled following the medical review and resolution of discrepancies. Depending on the type of the study, imaging results may be required in the adjudication process. There may be a use of a third party, such as an imaging core laboratory that performs the analyses, such as for tumor measurement on a CAT scan or restenosis location and measurements in an angiography. The sponsor will need to coordinate with the core lab to ensure that the analysis is completed prior to the adjudication process. They should be mindful that core labs that handle a large volume of projects from multiple sponsors will typically perform their analyses in batches and not case by case in real time. Priorities are typically placed on upcoming data analysis for regulatory submission, interim analyses, and ad hoc requests for presentations at academic conferences. The core lab will often need a separate request to perform urgent reads on a per-event basis. Again, at minimum, the CEC process will be halted and, at worst, result in erroneous adjudication with this missing piece of vital data. Also of note is that core labs have their own databases, and some may refuse to make redundant entries in the sponsor's EDC and provide a separate output from their own databases instead. Finally, whether it be automated from the EDC or done manually by an email, the adjudicators or the committee should be made aware that the event is ready for review. I'm going to provide a very simplified visual of the flow and the tasks that I described. The complexities and the potential for administrative errors increase incrementally with every piece of data that resides outside of the EDC. The event comes to life when the sites report of an AE or SAE. If the reporting is not done in an EDC, a robust process for storing and tracking paper CRFs and recording the adjudication yes-no determination is required. The screening for each event can occur manually or systematically, as I just talked about, and source documents and imaging data, if applicable, will be requested. If the methods of source document submission includes paper delivery by fax or FedEx, a robust process for storing and tracking the request and receipt is required. The medical reviewer would review the receipt source documents. The double bidirectional errors illustrate the multiple back and forth communications that typically occur to request additional information and or to resolve discordant data. It would be ideal to give a heads up to the core lab on the upcoming need for a priority read at this point, rather than an urgent request after the receipt of or upload of images. The methods of image submission by the sites may include a use of a web interface to which the sites would upload images, or for copies of the raw data, such as the CD-ROM, to be sent directly to the core lab and or the sponsor. Here again, a robust tracking process is required. As I said in the last slide, the analysis result may be provided as a report or paper CRF outside of the EDC, which again requires a robust tracking process. The reviewer should confirm that the upload and the completed analysis in the EDC or otherwise ensure receipt of analysis results from outside the system. In the latter case, again, it needs to be incorporated manually into the submission packet. To keep this visual simple, I did not include a potential use of other possible third parties, such as an EKG core lab or central lab for blood work. They would also have their own database and typically will not make redundant entries in the sponsor's EDC. The results would be provided as a report, which again requires a robust tracking process and needs to be incorporated manually into the submission packet. I hope I illustrated that this process, even in its very skeletal form, is very labor-intensive, time-consuming, and requires a lot of timely coordination. This all loops back to my previous statement that the goal should be for a single submission without erroneous or missing data that adds more steps and can also potentially influence the adjudication result. The process is only halfway complete once the adjudication does take place. The medical reviewer should perform quality checks on the results that includes ensuring that the adjudication result reflect the correct application to the study endpoint definition, that the results that are documented in the CEC minutes, if applicable, and that those results match the entries in adjudication CRF or ECRF. In the case of parallel review by individual adjudicators, there will hopefully be a use of an EDC, whereas the mismatch results will be identified by a built-in algorithm and also allow for aggregate reviews of all results. The process may be that the individual adjudicators and/or the third adjudicator are automatically notified of the discordance by the system, or that they must be followed up outside of the system by individual emails by the medical reviewer. Once the adjudications are complete with no outstanding inquiries, the adjudication's ECRF should be blocked to prevent further changes. The quality process would be repeated for every re-adjudication. Re-adjudication may be warranted for a number of reasons, including but not limited to new information becomes available, or site entries of critical data have changed, or that the adjudication result is discordant with the endpoint definition. The last point does not necessarily mean that the adjudication was performed incorrectly. It may be that the adjudicators made a sound medical decision to override the endpoint definition. The sponsor needs to understand these exceptions on a case-by-case basis and be able to speak to them when they come in question later by an auditor, DSMB, or regulatory authorities. The sponsor representative owning this process is often faced with providing interim updates for project management purposes, and I listed some of the most common ones here. Think back on my flowchart and imagine doing all of this interim tracking for hundreds of events in an Excel sheet. This is not to say that this is impossible, because I had done this in small paper trials, but it is nearly impossible in large trials with rapid enrollment and short endpoint analysis intervals, and/or that the sponsor is juggling multiple studies with the CEC process. Here, I will turn the mic over to my co-presenter, Brian, for further discussion on how adjudication modules in the EDC would be able to assist in streamlining and maximizing efficiency in this process.
Thank you very much, Kyoko. And that was an excellent introduction into how technology can help with endpoint adjudication workflows, and that's what my talk will be about this afternoon. Trying to advance here, let's see. Okay, so thank you. So looking again at Kyoko's excellent process diagram of the typical adjudication workflow, and it highlights the complexities and the challenges inherent with the process. As Kyoko described very well, it's actually a multi-layered process with many back and forth iterations before a final outcome can be reached in a single event. In this one adjudication process diagram, we have a very complicated matrix of roles and responsibilities. There are a number of methods and tools to provide the requisite capabilities. There are action items that need to be tracked and followed up on. There's a great deal of data that needs to be anonymized, submitted, reviewed, clarified, organized, promoted, reviewed again, and adjudicated. We see tasks that are prerequisite for subsequent tasks, divergent workflows depending on what just happened in the process, etc. At the end of this particular process is an output in the form of a final outcome, and this is for a single event. All of these elements in this one process need to be tracked, they need to be managed and reported on for a single clinical endpoint or safety event. If you take all of that complexity and multiply it by a few hundred or 1,000 events, you add in a couple hundred sites residing in dozens of countries and time zones, and a handful of inpatient physicians trying to reach a conclusion at the back end, you have a pretty good idea of the challenges we face in just a single project. Once you start to consider multiple projects and programs and all the complexities within the workflow, you can see how the system can easily break down. It can actually become quite frightening. And speaking of frightening, you also have to be able to produce an audit trail for each of the elements in this process. On this slide, I've listed some of the tools that are typically used to conduct an adjudication workflow, many of which Kyoko mentioned earlier. And thinking back again about the process diagram, you can see where each of these tools can fit into the process from your own experience. While each of these tools independently support certain activities, and they do provide some utility, there's little or no integration or sharing of data between any of them. This, of course, requires the people managing this process to find ways to keep track of all of the moving parts and participants in the adjudication process. Many sponsors and research organizations have had to develop their own tracking tools to try to keep their eye on the ball when it comes to these workflows. Finally, while the use of many of these tools crosses over the various types of organizations involved in endpoint adjudication, the one common resource that's shared across all sponsor and research organizations maintaining a grasp on the adjudication process has been Herculean human effort. You heard Kyoko mention EDC quite a bit in her presentation, and EDC has certainly brought some incremental improvement to the process over time. As EDC has become relatively ubiquitous in clinical trials, people have begun to use EDCs to help track and record adjudication processes, and it makes sense in the absence of a comprehensive adjudication system. Using EDC introduced obvious improvements in the traceability of data collection, but the improvements are naturally limited by the design and purpose of EDC systems. EDC is very good at collecting and recording data in a flat database format. EDC is not very good at supporting adjudication workflows and the many dependencies in even a single event's progression. Therefore, it falls to the coordinating group where they still need to track and manage the movement of an event through the entire workflow using manually driven triggers for progression. Furthermore, each EDC database is its own entity. Managing endpoint processes across multiple studies requires discrete login credentials and permissions, and cross-study reporting is not possible. Medical images are often a key data point needed for endpoint or event determination. DICOM images are most often managed in an out-of-band or parallel process, as EDCs do not have the capability to effectively manage large, complex data sets like DICOM. EDC-enabled adjudication modules are very limited in flexibility of configuration. EDC offers minimal workflow capabilities with little or no flexibility or variation allowed in any practical sense. Therefore, the use of EDC in adjudication does little to alleviate the pain points in the process as described earlier, and it often increases timelines and costs beyond the benefits. So if one were to go back and say that you were able to stop and begin to design an electronic adjudication system from the ground up that really reflects your optimal process, what sort of requirements would you ask for? I've taken the liberty of putting on this slide some of the requirements that many of the users we've spoken with have listed. Once more, if you think about the process flow in Kyoko's presentation and how a system can help you not only play a role in the process, but effectively manage the process, you're likely to come up with a similar list. The more of these requirements that are met by features within an electronic adjudication system, the fewer the other tools on the previous slide that you'll need to employ. Given the requirements listed on the previous slide, here's some of the main design principles required in order to implement a useful electronic adjudication system. The first is flexibility. Remember that you should be able to have the system reflect your process versus having to change your process to fit the limitations of technology. The system should improve visibility to the process. You should be able to see as much of the process as possible, including a granular view of the event progression, all of the tasks, dependencies, and assignments that go along with it. The system should, of course, be usable. It should be clean and easy to navigate with obvious calls to action, notifications, and a modern, intuitive interface. The electronic adjudication system should consider the points of view of all participants in the process. Comprehensiveness. A useful system should include as much of the functionality as possible required to not only participate in the adjudication of events, but in the identification of events, the preparation of the case packages, and reporting of the endpoints. This includes query capabilities, system-driven progression, and a great deal of customization to suit different scenarios brought upon by different indications and different event types. As an electronic system, automation should, of course, be part of the design and part of the feature set. Users should not be required to manually progress endpoints through the process. Criteria is specified within the charter regarding the progression of endpoints, and the EAS should reflect those versus having things need to be tracked outside of the system and managed elsewise. System should be secure. That's a prerequisite for any electronic system in clinical research. Security in this sense also speaks to the ability to manage access to data for blinding purposes. And finally, you need to have compliance. All actions in the process need to be fully documented, and the system should be able to track and produce evidence in the form of an audit trail and final outcome report for all data that's considered within it. So in conclusion, the point of this presentation is to propose a call to action on the part of sponsors and research organizations who are managing endpoint adjudication processes. Technology has evolved to the point where it's time to revisit traditional approach to managing and conducting adjudication. Technology, after all, exists to make your life easier, not more difficult. And I'm talking about more than just electronic case report forms. If you can conduct virtually all adjudication workflow activities within a single environment, the effort and overhead required to manage this process will be greatly reduced. And the last point on the slide then is, since this kind of workflow can be accommodated in an electronic system, there are other related activities one might consider as appropriate within a single platform. And I've listed some of those here for your consideration. For example, DMC activities, screening committees who are looking at complex eligibility requirements and doing a central confirmation of those for enrollment, and finally, central image reviews within an academic core lab setting.
Well, thank you, Kyoko and Brian, for this valuable information regarding the adjudication technologies. We appreciate you sharing your expertise on this subject. At this point, I'd like to remind our listeners to use the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to answer all the questions within the designated time. However, there may be more questions we have time for, and therefore this webinar has been recorded, and you can access the entire presentation and questions at either Emanate Life Sciences or our sponsors' websites, Criterion Edge or AG Mednet. Let's start with some of the questions here. Kyoko and Brian, one of the first questions is, what if a site can't obtain the requested medical records and or the images of an outer facility?
The CECs that I have worked with would make their best judgment based on EDC entries and adjudicate conservatively, that is, in the worst case scenario. So if the site reported that a coronary revascularization occurred, but is unable to provide a cath report and or the images, the CEC would adjudicate that as a target lesion revascularization, and the sponsor takes a hit. These hits are very painful, especially with studies with a relatively small population, or that the event rates are so low that every 1% or even lower could greatly affect the results between the investigative versus the comparative product. So every effort should be made to obtain the required material to avoid these hits, as each of these do add to the final endpoint analysis.
Okay, then why do AEs have to be coded in MedDRA for event identification?
They do not. It is not a requirement, but it is very labor intensive and time consuming without it if the AE field in the ECRF is a free text field. By site's verbatim term, an MI could be reported as STEMI, non-STEMI, QMI, non-QMI, both in abbreviations and spelled out. myocardial infarction, coronary infarction, acute clinical syndrome, heart attack, or if they come from an old school like me, there also was a time when MI used to be named in terms of its location, such as anterior, inferior, or lateral MI. So this will take a manual review to sort through them individually to identify it as a potential endpoint event. If these examples are coded in MedDRA, a systematic approach could be applied to the higher level where all of these would fall into the same bucket.
Okay, and for our other listeners, please feel free to add some additional questions. Also, why is reconciliation between data entries and medical records be needed during document review, since the CEC adjudicators would only be reviewing the medical records anyway?
It is not required for the CEC process, but highly recommended activity to keep your database clean for later internal analysis purposes. From my own experience, separate analysis sets were pulled from EDC data for publication purposes, and also doing deep dives into understanding the differences in MI rates by using different definitions, and for making decisions for which definitions to use in future studies.
Okay. I'm going to skip down to Sean. Can an EAS help automate a dossier or package creation?
Brian?
Sorry, I think I was on mute, my fault.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, that's one of the key features of an electronic adjudication system. The collection, submission, the call for and submission of source data is then processed, reviewed, and organized by the coordinating center, whether that be within the sponsor or within a research organization. And dossier creation is something that's a key element of an electronic adjudication system. The package that's produced, as Kyoko mentioned, oftentimes you receive a great amount of source data that is irrelevant to the case. And so you really need some good tools to be able to cull through that information and present only the appropriate information forward to the adjudicators. And so having that organized in the proper fashion with bookmarks and notes and narratives, if those are part of your process, is all part of the design of a good system.
Great. Kyoko, this looks like a question for you. Is that really the role of the CEC to clean the data? Seems that it should fall back on the CRAs to do SDD.
Yes, it is not the role of the CEC, and I'm sorry if I misrepresented. The medical reviewer on the sponsor side, and yes, also the CRAs performing the source document verification, that is their role to keep the data clean. But how I wanted to present was that should be part of the source document review process by the medical reviewer. And absolutely right, it is not the role of the CEC.
Okay. Also, can you provide examples of solutions to encourage adjudicators to perform timely adjudication?
In my own experience, a good relationship as far as an organized process for the advance notification of what was to come was very helpful. In large trials with multiple events, that was extremely difficult. But the more communication and systems in place that was instituted, such as advance notification that 10 events were coming your way by next Wednesday, and we need you to have the results in by Friday, for instance. Those were very helpful. Individual adjudicators who are full-time physicians definitely did not do well with 10 events all of a sudden coming into their email and being asked to do the adjudications very quickly. So it is very difficult when doing the individual adjudication style versus a committee format where the entire process will be actually controlled by a clinical reviewer equivalent person at the CRO end. So communication.
Okay, and we have somebody who says, I've been working with CECs for several years. Could you talk about the benefits of waiting until a patient has had follow-up and maybe even monitoring by CRA before pushing a case to the CEC for review?
Absolutely. It would be the very ideal scenario that the source document verification would have occurred at the site before the medical reviewer even identifies the event, and that the critical data such as cardiac enzymes I bring again because it's an easy error to make. That would be the most ideal situation, but as the clinical research world is moving more and more towards remote monitoring, and also you might not be able to afford waiting if there is a data cut coming up. So there might already be a data cut and plan and monitoring in place where you cannot wait for the follow-up or the monitoring visit to occur. This is especially true when the data cuts cannot be moved, such as for planned DSMB meetings, and also some interim analysis that might have been promised to the regulatory authorities. But yes, it would be the ideal situation if it was allowed timing-wise and in relationship to other activities.
Okay, another question is, why would adjudicators be allowed to override the study endpoint definition?
In my example, an older definition might have been too simple and not encompass the actual clinical diagnosis of the event. So in the setting of no symptoms and no EKG changes between the baseline and event EKG, the CEC may adjudicate as no MI if the reason for the cardiac enzyme or the biomarker elevation is clearly documented as having a cause other than ischemia. A third-party CEC with medical expertise in that therapeutic area would be used precisely for these kinds of clinical assessments.
Okay, and this question is for Brian. How would an EAS manage disagreement between adjudicators?
Yeah, that's a great question. Kyoko mentioned the definitions, and there's criteria that's set forth within the charter for deciding whether a case is finally adjudicated or whether there's concordance or discordance or agreement or disagreement, depending on your preferred terms. The part of the basis of the design of the system behind the ECRFs that the individual adjudicators are filling would be a comparison of results and which are major disagreements, which are minor disagreements. The algorithm would then determine where that case needs to go, whether it is fully adjudicated, whether it needs to go back to the coordinating group for review before it moves to committee, or whether it should automatically move to committee in a 2+1 setting. So all of that is part of the design, and in fact, a useful system would be able to manage different types of scenarios depending upon different types of events. So if you had a MACE event versus a stroke event in the same trial, you could have a different algorithm completely. You could even have a different CEC group considering the data to be adjudicated. So all of that, again, is part of the design of the system.
Okay, and what if the medical reviewer doesn't agree with the adjudication result?
They can make an inquiry to the CEC and ask for their rationale or submit additional data that may warrant re-adjudication of the event. But ultimately, the CEC prevails, as they should, and there doesn't need to be an agreement. The very purpose of having an external CEC is for their expert third-party judgment that is free of sponsor bias.
Okay, another question. Can adjudicators get access to view medical images using the same adjudication platform?
In fact, you can, certainly with ours, with our JUDI system, that's a capability. We are at our base level, we are an imaging company, so inclusion of medical images in the adjudication workflow is part of the design of our system. Obviously, that's ideal to have the key data points that are being considered for a case reside within the same database for traceability and access point of view. So that's definitely something that we have made part of our platform, and I think should be a part of any adjudication scenario when you're talking about medical device, especially when you're using a lot of medical images to help resolve these cases.
Great. Okay. And our very last question we have here is: can imaging CRFs be part of the EAS database versus having to get that data from core labs separately?
Yeah, Kyoko spoke a little bit about this in her talk as well. Sometimes core labs would be reluctant to have, to enter data into more than one place. So you could certainly set up an imaging eCRF, or you can have a placeholder for the report or a report or a PDF of the data output that comes from the core lab. So really depends upon how your workflow is set up and who you're working with and what their preferences are. And if I were a sponsor, I guess, I think you have more heft than you sometimes think when you're negotiating these sorts of things with core labs. But I think there are key benefits to having all of your data reside in a single place, especially when it pertains to the, endpoints that are this valuable and important to your study.
Okay, it looks like there is one more question. Can you please elaborate on the medical reviewer's role?
Elaborate on medical reviewer's role. In my last webinar, I made a point that this would be very sponsor specific, and how the tasks are defined by job descriptions or otherwise the roles. So there may be companies that have their CRAs help with most of this groundwork, as far as identifying events, and perhaps even doing the actual submissions. So it is really sponsor specific, but the environments that I have come from they are actually dedicated to reviewing all the AEs and SAEs that come in and making determinations as far as adjudicability and reportability to the regulatory authorities, which is a whole nother piece. So in that role, the safety group actually made both of these determinations and initiated the source document request and had the help of the field team, field CRA team, for actually obtaining the source document sometimes. But we were also tasked with doing all the coordination with the core lab and the advanced notifications that I talked about, and also keeping an eagle eye on the adjudication results themselves, because those were our endpoints. So again, that would be completely up to the individual sponsor company and how their infrastructure is, and if they can even afford to have medical reviewers who can be dedicated to doing only these kinds of reviews. And I have run into companies in my prior CRO life where they just get the adjudications done and they do not check on the adjudication results.
Okay, Kyoko, thank you. If anybody would like to put in a last question, we will wait for that. Otherwise, on behalf of Emanate Life Sciences and Criterion Edge and AG Mednet, we'd like to thank you for attending this webinar. Before you go, we'd like to make you aware that Emanate Life Sciences and Hewlett-Packard will be hosting a networking event at HP in Palo Alto, California on December 11th. This exciting event will take place at the Hewlett-Packard Showcase and Innovation Center, and the topic will be how virtual reality and 3D printing impacts clinical trials. Look for an email that has registration information regarding this event, or you can register for any of our events at www.emanatelifesciences.com. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.